Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the newsletter focused on part two of Intel's woes and strategic options. And for those of you that are joining for the first time, instead of writing it as a newsletter, I thought I would make a video and make it a little bit more dynamic. I'm actually going to flip through a few of the investor relation pages from Intel and a few other websites just to make this a little bit more interesting. And quick recap for what I talked about in part one of this article, and then we'll get right into part two. So I wrote this article probably about two weeks ago now, really around Intel's challenges that it was facing, and really what triggered it was this letter from Third Point, which is a hedge fund, and they wrote a letter to Intel saying, "Hey, you need to turn the ship around, or else, we're going to have to propose some drastic changes around here." And at this point, Third Point had about $1 billion stake in Intel, or about 0.5% of the company's valuation, which is around $200 billion. Now, it's understandable why that was the case. Like if you take a look at 2020 performance for Intel, it was not kind, whereas the rest of the stock market was doing terrific. Particularly Nasdaq, you see the precipitous decline that Intel had in 2020. So not a good year, right? If you're an investor, and that's not just true for that's actually only true for 2020. If you look at the last 5 years, the story looks a little bit different, right? So if you start with 2016 and go up to beginning of 2020, Intel, which is the blue line here, yes, it started out slow, but it actually did quite well. It actually mirrored the Nasdaq index. It's only in 2020 that you start to see this big deviation happening here. And we'll get into kind of why that happened, but basically, this was a very upsetting or very influential point for investors in Intel. And then I talked a little bit about kind of what makes up Intel's business. So they're pretty big actually. It's about a $70 billion company, and the PC business. When you think about kind of laptops, desktops, that makes up 54% of the revenues. And I talk about the decline of the PC market as we know it, and then the increasing competition, even within the PC market from the likes of AMD and Apple. And then I focus on the data center side, and how there's a little bit of hope there. Now, I only focus on two predominant areas of Intel's businesses because this makes up, I would say, a good chunk of their business. I would say close to 80% or more. The rest of the business is actually some of their emerging and growth bets, right? It makes up 14%. Um, when we think about levers and changes for the business, yes, these are going to be important functions going forward. But when you think about what drives the business today, it's really the PC business and the data center business. And so I leave this question at the end, which is what would have to be true for Intel to maintain the leadership position that it had in the past? And so I hope you had some time to think about it if you did read this article before. But what I want to do now is maybe focus on how would you answer this question? And for those that are in my JRE 410 class, a lot of the concepts you'll learn throughout the semester, but I want to give you a quick crash course to be able to answer this question here. And so to start, what I'm going to do is go to the investor relations page for Intel. And in the investor relations page, you typically, when you go to the company's website, you'll see investor relations. And that page, the investor relations, is really good information for learning about a company's strategy and what the financial results have been to date. As you see here, one of the things that are being highlighted on the Intel homepage is the announcement of the new CEO, which happened in the last 2 weeks, right? And this was one of the things that was in the news as far as whether the current CEO of Intel, who's a non-technical leader, whether he's the right leader for Intel, given the types of products that Intel makes, which tends to be very much, microchip-oriented semiconductors, right? It tends to warrant a certain type of leadership that the current CEO couldn't. essentially live up to, right? So that's being announced here, but we're not going to focus too much on the news, but what we're going to do is maybe go through a couple of other pages that focus on Intel's business. But I do encourage you to check it out as far as what the investor page has to offer. There is this interesting article um, around the new CEO's announcement. So he's Pat. He's actually a former Intel executive. He used to be at Intel for about 30 years before he moved out to EMC and VMware, and looks like he's returning. And he's a technical guy, it appears. But moving from that and moving into this page right here, which is really focused on the segments. And this is an interesting page because it breaks down all of Intel's different business lines and shows you what the trend has been like over the last 5 years and what is the revenue composition as far as the total kind of $70 billion, right? So this is the data center group. Clearly, it represents a sizable chunk in terms of almost a third of the total business. In terms of the growth, what you see here is, there seems to be really good growth from 2016, 17, 18, and then something happens in 2019. And we'll want to understand at some point what happened here to see this noticeable decline, especially when it was on a nice clip like this. The other piece that we want to take a look at is the PC business down below. So, as mentioned earlier, PC business makes up 54% of the business. And again, it was doing quite well in terms of growth, but then 2019, not so good, right? So, that's something to watch out for. This is actually not terrible given how the PC market is growing. So, it's not overly surprising, I would say, but from a volume perspective, what's happening with PCs. But it makes you wonder whether Intel has the same pricing power it does, right? Because when you think about revenue, it's a function of both price and volume. So if the revenue is staying flat and the volume is declining, you have to wonder what is the impact of pricing, right? And certainly you'd have to take a look at the relative proportion of the decline in the volume as well as the increase in price. The other areas that are called out here are the Internet of Things group. So this is really around edge computing. So when you think about cloud computing, massive, massive infrastructure that is very much with the hyperscale cloud providers centralized. IoT is very much at the edge, right? When you think about smart devices in remote locations or even in your home that may have a chip inside them. So Intel is forecasting kind of growth in this business, and certainly, this business is doing much better than the other two that we focused on. You could argue it's because it's a small number, but certainly it looks positive for the business. And right now it's about 4%. There are other areas that we're going to go through quickly, and then we'll switch gears. So Mobileye is focused on looks like advanced driver assistance systems. So think of this as within your vehicle, some type of smart technology or some type of autonomous technology, not full autonomous, but basic kind of capabilities, right? And this was an acquisition that Intel made a little while ago, and it's a very small fraction of the company. Then you see kind of other pieces of the business here, memory business that seems to be, you know, experiencing the same thing as far as growth. There seems to be this anomaly in 2019, and then this final piece is the um, typically the FPGA business. So when you think of traditional CPUs, you can't really program them. They're designed to do one thing, and they do that. Whereas the FPGA, you can program it as a designer to do different things, right? And so it's a good it's typically used quite extensively in labs to simulate certain behavior, and then once you have the right behavior, then you turn it into kind of a CPU that performs the intended tasks, and it's very prescribed at that point. The other thing I want to take a look at, just to give you a little bit of flavor for what's offered on this investor relations page, is also things around how Intel executes, how they use the capital that they generate from their business, as well as what is their foundational um, success, or what's key to their success. And they talk a little bit here in terms of different layers that they're focused on. They're not focused on just the hardware aspect of it, but also the process aspect, how things connect together, the security layer, as well as the software, pulling it all together. One tool that I use in addition to investor relations is Pitchbook. Pitchbook, what it does is it typically collects good amount of financial and non-financial information on the company, and it summarizes in nice tables. So instead of having to go through year by year annual report through the investor relations page, I can just go to Pitchbook and take a look at the performance over the last little while. One of the modules that, or one of the panels that you see here is the valuation. And these are different ways in which Intel is being valued. And if you take a look at kind of the blue line here, that's the current price. So clearly towards lower end in terms of the price. You could argue whether that translates into good value or not. That's something that we need to talk about. In addition to valuation, I talked about the financial summary, so we're going to head there now. Other information here as well. And so when I get to this view here, what I like to take a look at, typically income statement, I'll take a look at balance statement, but just in the sake of kind of brevity, what I want to do is highlight a few things as part of ratios, and then we'll move into some of the questions that we want to answer for Intel. So a couple of things to call out here. Um, if you take a look at kind of inventory turnover ratio, as well as cash conversion cycle, which is an indication of from when you produce something to when you actually collect cash. If you take a look at this trend, it's actually increasing, right? So from 2014, that it was 45 days to convert to cash, and then now it's about 83 days, right? Or whenever the recent 2019 financials was presented. So that's not a good signal when you think about efficiency of the business. What it also tells me is Intel is losing a bit of leverage over its customers. So customers are taking a little bit longer, or they're not in a rush to pay them back, which is not a good thing, right? If you're a dominant player in the industry, certainly you would expect this to be either stable or to improve over time. One interesting thing here is it looks like sales per full-time employee seems to be good. Um, it does jump up a little bit, and it does show some type of an improvement here. And then there's a bit, you could call this flat almost, which is not too bad. The other thing that Intel has going for it is gross margin, right? If you take a look at gross margin, which is essentially revenue minus the cost of goods sold for their businesses, it's about 58 to kind of 63%, right, over this time period, which is pretty good, you could argue, for hardware-based businesses. And the other piece is EBITDA, which is really around, what does the profitability look like once you pay for salaries and things like that? It's actually close to 48% in 2019. So that's a very high margin business for um, a company like Intel, which is very much in hardware, right? Typically in software, you'll see gross margins of 85%, higher than the 55 or the 50s that you see here. Um, but from an EBITDA perspective, software companies tend to have anywhere between kind of 30 to 45% EBITDA margin. So this is pretty good when you think about in terms of profitability of this business. And you could argue whether that's due to the fact that Intel is vertically integrated, from the fact that it does design, it does the manufacturing, and it does pretty much everything. And you could argue whether is that too much for a company if it needs to change and evolve quickly to the market needs. So what I'm going to do is maybe call out what are the different ideas that are there, and then we'll pause there and pick up kind of the solutions for the next video. And so a few of the options are, hey, number one, the strategy seems to be good, meaning Intel is focused on the right things, and the real problem is execution, meaning we need to have a better way of um, getting the product out the door, selling. We need to have better product release cycles. We can't take 2-3 years to release something in a competitive market, but we're focused on the right things. So that would be kind of the first view. The second view would say, hey, the execution, yes, it is a problem, but the strategic direction is also a problem, meaning the company is focused on kind of the not so right things for the future, right? And that you could argue, hey, maybe we need to rethink what we do in the PC business or what we do in the data center business. So those are some of the questions that you may want to ask. Third could be, I would say, a little bit of hybrid of both. Hey, there needs to be both a strategy side as well as an execution focus. And then the fourth one would be, hey, you know, we're pretty good in terms of revenue growth within the market that we've chosen, but what we should really focus on is efficiencies and cost containment. So think about those four options, and I'll meet you in the next video.